to share any thoughts, reflections, any questions. Matt put one in the chat. Matt, do you want to share? You can kick off.
Thanks, Nigel. You asked me to write a question in there, so I didn't know I was having to speak as well, but that's fine. You've both spoken about climate change and trauma. How do we encourage our congregations to treat the environment and people more seriously to enable reconciliation from trauma in a missional way, where, let's be honest, some of our congregations are just glad to be back on a Sunday. And the hymn, as it says, look around you, can't you see? So how do we encourage our congregations to be more engaged?
Well, we have to expose them to something that will make them uneasy with just going to church on Sunday and feeling satisfied. So you can expose the congregation by having mission moments where people come and tell the story. It's especially helpful if they have some visuals, a video or something, and they can talk about it for 5 or 10 minutes. The other thing is to take them on field trips to see an example of restorative work where there's been damage, so they can be made aware of damage and also aware of a solution that they could participate in. So I think offering a clear vision of what the problem is and one avenue or 2 avenues toward restoration can then inspire them to get involved.
I would say very similar to what Elaine said. I think exposing people, I think the only way to address trauma is for people to hear it and to actually know that it's there. But I think the one thing I would say is making the congregation aware that it will make them uncomfortable. And the best example I can give is when there was the reaction to the Sarah Everard case in recent months, and lots of women came out and spoke about how upset it made them and their experiences of sexual assault and that trauma. And a lot of the backlash was from people saying, yes, but it's not all men, it's not all men, not all men. And what that showed is that actually there were some, mainly men, whose masculinity was so fragile, they were so fragile with that it made them uncomfortable to hear that. And you have to be ready to hear that it's just because you're uncomfortable with hearing something doesn't mean that you shouldn't hear it, and you're going to have to look past that. Like your comfortableness is not more important than the issue that's arisen. And you can relate that to a whole load of issues. Black Lives Matter are, being uncomfortable with addressing the issues of racial injustice. My comfort as a white person in not having to hear that is not more important than the fact that Black people are being oppressed and are facing the trauma of racial injustice. So I think helping our congregations to see that you being uncomfortable and breaking down privilege is less important than actually addressing that trauma, and that takes a lot of hand-holding and pastoral care, but is really I've learned is really important. So yeah, that's what I would say. Be ready to be uncomfortable.
One other thing too that occurs to me, and that's so good what you just said, Phoebe, about who gets centered in these conversations. Is it our comfort, right? That's not good. But also, now I just lost track of what I was going to say. Yeah, I'll come back to it.
That's fine. I'm going to open the screen, the floor, so to speak, for anybody else. If they've just put your hand up, if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Take notice of what Jennifer said in the chat. They don't need to be formed questions. They can just be reflections and what's on your heart. Denise.
Hi, and thank you, Elaine and Phoebe. This is more of a reflection and maybe the start of a thought process for me, which I hope will be fruitful. It may sound like a ramble to begin with, so apologies for that. I was taken by your premise that change happens from the you know, from the local rather than from the top. And looking at the amazing things that your community are doing, I'm now taking it back to my small West London church community and thinking about the exposure. I think, you know, sort of at the age of 65, I'm probably one of the younger people in the church community. We are regularly exposed by amazing people coming to talk to us, special services about, you know, based on All We Can or Water Aid or Action for Children, Christian Aid. And the response is always incredibly positive and supportive, and donations get made. Other churches in our circuit are very much more hands-on. They run Baby Basics, they run a bike recycling for refugees initiative and other things, which are very actively supported by our church community. But I'm slightly struggling with the sort of hands-onness. Really, you know, we can put our hands in our pockets because we're fortunate. We can pray, which is invaluable. But I'm just struck by how much change are we making or not making at that local level. So thank you for starting that thought process. I may go around in a complete circle with it, but it's been useful to have that triggered. So thank you both.
Thank you, Denise. I've got a question. I think it's really looking from Phoebe's point of view, but Elaine, be helpful and interesting to see if you're finding the same things. That Phoebe, you've travelled around the British Connection, and for the last year, you talked about your vision for a new world and a new home. What are the major things that young people are saying to you around the connection about the climate crisis, or even any other subject, or where they feel they're not being heard on? And would that be the same from your point of view, Elaine, from where you are?
I think that from meeting children and young people, it's all been virtual, and that's had some really fruitful conversations come from it. Children and young people are really ready. They're ready to, I guess, be the movers and shakers. They're already being the movers and shakers. I guess we're in the position now where children and young people are kind of a little bit fed up. They're like, we've been saying this to the church over and over again for years. We've said this is what we care about, this is what the church should care about, and nothing's really changed. So they're just getting on with it themselves and being like, right, well, you're not doing anything, so we'll do it. And I think that actually that's quite important for the church to hear, because children and young people are doing it themselves, and the church will be left behind if the church doesn't actually start doing something as well. And I think it's about journeying together. It's not about, you know, children and young people are, you know, perfect and the rest of the adult church is not. It's about how can we journey together, how can we support each other, and how can we be a church that doesn't just listen and nod to children and young people about, oh, well, that's well and good, that's really nice that you care about the climate crisis, but actually pays attention to their prophetic voice and goes, okay, this is the direction that God's moving in. How can we actively respond to that? And I think in a lot of ways, we're moving towards a time where children and young people are needing to be enabled to do that work even further. I think in my conversations with children and young people, a lot of the time, the barrier is we can't do this because those adults in our local church won't let us, or we don't feel we can approach that conversation. And actually, I don't think it's the fact that the adults in the church aren't interested or won't listen, but there's a bridge that needs to be built. There's a gap that we're not listening to each other. And that takes a lot of time to build and to work on. But I think that adults have a really important role in doing that. In reality, adults still hold a lot of power in the church. As much as I understand that it can be scary for an adult to approach a group of children and young people, it's far scarier for a child or young person to approach their minister and say, this is what I think and this is what I want to change. So I guess what I'm saying is children and young people are really passionate about all of these things, about Black Lives Matter, about the climate crisis, about being a church that's welcoming to all, about inclusivity for those in the LGBT plus community, all of those things. But what the biggest thing is that they want action, and they want the church to take action, and the church needs to just get on and do it and be brave enough to approach children and young people and build that bridge. So that was quite a rambly response. No. I hope that helps.
I mean, Elaine, I don't know if you want to follow on from any of that or from where you are.
Just 3 quick thoughts. One of them was that we can ground all of this in scripture easily. And that's really important for helping to translate to an established congregation who's kind of been there a while, that this is really godly work. The second thing is that in my context, young people just bypass the church, just bypass it and go ahead and join the Black Lives Matter movement or the climate justice movement or one of these other movements, because they want to do practices. They want to do practices that make a difference. And so they not only go and do protests and activism, but they also choose a minimalist lifestyle and live in a tiny house and share jobs. I mean, their lifestyle is taking on flesh and blood in the way that they think they need to change the world. So that tells me the third thing is that in the church, as we're raising kids, we need a completely different educational model. We need to teach our kids how to practice a contemplative life and how to do justice work. With those 2 things together, and our curriculum needs to focus on these things rather than what we might have been doing, right?
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, and I think Eve is going to ask a question, and then we'll go into some closing worship, some thank yous and some closing worship. Eve.
Thank you, Nigel. My question is to Elaine. Firstly, to say thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. There's so much to learn and take away from it. Thank you. But I just wanted to ask you, I mean, you're doing enormous work. I know you mentioned the fact that you do have volunteers, but there must be some cost implications. And I just wondered where your funding comes from.
We have, like, if you think of a Venn diagram, I hope you all remember what a Venn diagram with the 3 circles and then the overlapping thing. So we have a decentralized mission church with an active core group of about 25 people. And then we have a new monastic residential community, which is 2 houses. There are 3 families on site at this time, including a refugee family from an African context. And then our lead farmer and our pastor for our church, he and his family are from Kenya. So they are there. And then my husband and myself. And then there's one other couple that owns the farming part of the property, and my husband and I own the retreat and forest side of the property. All of us bring our skills and our resources to the task. We have a grant, several grants that we got to kickstart the farming project. And we're now developing an income stream from a community supported agriculture, CSA, where people can subscribe and get a box of vegetables every week. And our goal is that within 2.5 years, we'll be able to fund what we're doing through a combination of our CSA business, which is good for the earth and good for people, and it builds community, and through tithes and offerings, sort of a traditional way of supporting a church. So our goal is within 2.5 years, it'll be self-sustaining. But the properties are owned by some of us, so we're not having to ask the denomination for money for the property. That's our properties that we own, two families own. And we have a working business plan to generate the revenue stream that will cover much of the cost of doing this ministry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Friends, I want to say a huge thank you to Elaine and Phoebe, in particular on behalf of the district, for joining us for this weekend. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to ponder in how we share our stories with each other, interweave with God's story. So thank you for spending the time with us today.